quit my job, emptied my RRSP, and sold my grandmother's house to pay for my husband's cancer treatment. The morning his final scan came back clear, I walked into his hospital room and found him on the phone with my best friend, laughing softly, telling her the money was already moved. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then I smiled, turned around, and walked straight to the hospital's family law resource desk. I need to back up. My name is Megan. I'm 32 years old, and for the past 4 years, I was married to a man I genuinely believed was my person. We met at a mutual friend's housewarming in Kitchener, Ontario. He was charming and warm, and he made me feel, for the first time in my adult life, like someone was actually paying attention to me. Not performing attention, actually paying it. We dated for 2 years, got married at a small outdoor ceremony in Elora in September, and moved into a rental duplex in Waterloo while we saved up. He worked in commercial real estate. I was a dental hygienist. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic, just 2 people trying to build something. The house we eventually bought, a semi-detached in a quiet subdivision near Uptown, wasn't flashy, but it was ours. We put down 40% because my grandmother had passed the year before and left me her property in Brantford. I sold it, took the equity, and used it as our down payment. He always said that was the foundation of everything we built together. I used to feel proud when he said that. Now I understand he was just keeping inventory. He was diagnosed 14 months ago, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, stage 3. The oncologist at Grand River Hospital explained it calmly and thoroughly, the way doctors do when they've delivered this kind of news 100 times and have learned that calm is the most useful thing they can offer. My husband sat very still during that appointment. I was the one whose hands wouldn't stop shaking. The treatment plan was aggressive. Chemotherapy cycles, then immunotherapy, then a possible stem cell transplant depending on how his body responded. Our provincial coverage through OHIP handled the core treatment costs, but there were gaps. Private room upgrades because his immune system was too compromised for shared wards. Out-of-pocket medications not covered under his workplace plan, which had lapsed when he took early medical leave. Travel costs for specialized appointments at Princess Margaret in Toronto. A private nutritionist his oncologist strongly recommended. The numbers added up faster than I could track them. I used up my vacation days first, then went on unpaid leave from the clinic. I told my manager I didn't know how long I'd be gone. She was kind about it. I applied for the family caregiver benefit through employment insurance. It helped, but it didn't come close to replacing my income. My husband had some disability coverage through his work, but the monthly amount barely covered our mortgage and utilities. Everything else fell on me. I cashed out my RSP. $36,000 built up over 8 years of automatic contributions. I paid the withholding tax and didn't think twice about it. People kept telling me I'd regret it later, that I should think about my own future. I smiled and said his future was my future. I believed it completely. When that ran out, I sold the car, mine, not his, because he needed his for the occasional good week when he felt well enough to drive himself somewhere. I took the bus. I didn't mind. I told myself these were temporary sacrifices for a permanent outcome. I told myself we would rebuild. We had survived so much already. We would survive this too. The stem cell transplant was approved in the spring. It was the hardest part of his treatment and also the part that finally worked. I remember sitting in the waiting area at Princess Margaret while the procedure was happening, eating a granola bar I'd packed from home because I couldn't afford the hospital cafeteria and thinking, this is the worst day. But it is also the turning point. After this, things get better. I called my best friend to tell her the procedure had gone well. She had been my closest friend since university. We'd lived together in residence in our first year at Waterloo and had stayed close through every major chapter of each other's lives. She cried when I told her he was going to be okay. She said she was so relieved. She said she'd been praying for us. I didn't know then what I know now. The weeks after the transplant were a careful, quiet kind of hopeful. He was in a private recovery room and I was there most of every day. I'd bring things from home, his preferred tea, a novel he'd been meaning to read, the small framed photo of us from Elora that usually sat on our dresser. I wanted the room to feel less clinical. I wanted him to wake up to something that reminded him of home and of us. He was weak but recovering well. The transplant team was pleased. His blood work was trending in the right direction, and somewhere in that window of relief and exhaustion and gratitude, I stopped being vigilant. I stopped noticing things. She started visiting him at the hospital. I thought nothing of it at first. She and I were close, which meant she and he were friendly by association. She'd visited him once or twice during chemo, always when I was there. When she started coming on her own, I assumed it was because she wanted to give me a break, free up an afternoon where I could go home and sleep in my own bed for once. She brought him things. Good soup, decent magazines, a Bluetooth speaker because she knew he liked music while he rested. I thanked her for it. I actually thanked her. The morning everything changed. I arrived at the hospital a little earlier than usual. I'd had a reasonable sleep, a rare thing, and I felt something close to lightness as I walked through the parking garage. I had coffee for me and the herbal tea he liked. I was almost looking forward to the morning in a way I hadn't been in months. The door to his room was slightly ajar. I could hear his voice before I pushed it open, quieter than usual, almost careful. I heard her laugh, low and familiar. I stopped. "The accounts are already sorted," he was saying. "By the time she figures it out, there won't be much left to fight over." I didn't go in. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time, holding 2 cups of coffee in a cardboard tray, listening to my husband describe the logistics of dismantling our life while my best friend made sounds of encouragement. I set the coffee down on a chair by the nurse's station. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button for the ground floor. On the way down, I did not cry. I was not sad. I was something I don't have a clean word for. A very cold, very clear-headed version of myself that I hadn't met before but recognized immediately, the way you recognize your own handwriting. I walked to the hospital's patient and family services office. I asked the receptionist if they had any information on legal aid resources for family law matters. She handed me a laminated sheet with phone numbers. I took a photo of it with my phone. Then I went back upstairs and walked into his room as though I'd just arrived. "Hey," I said, smiling. "Sorry I'm late. The 401 was a disaster." She was sitting in the chair beside his bed, back straight, hands folded. The smile she gave me was smooth and immediate, and I had a sudden vivid memory of watching her in university. The way she could shift her expression like changing a slide. I'd always admired it then. I understood it differently now. "I was just keeping him company," she said. "That's so kind of you," I said, and I meant it as something else entirely. I stayed for an hour, made easy conversation, helped him with lunch, reminded him about his afternoon medication. She left before noon, squeezing his hand in a way she must have thought was subtle. When she hugged me goodbye in the hallway, I hugged her back. I am not proud of how long I was able to keep performing normal, but I needed time. That afternoon, while he slept, I went down to the hospital's parking lot and sat in his car, the one I'd kept so he could use it on good days, and I called my older cousin, who had gone through a messy divorce 3 years earlier and had come out the other side with her house and her sanity mostly intact. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. "You need a family law," she said. "Today? Not next week." "I don't have money for a lawyer," I said. "You don't have money not to have one," she said. "Call Legal Aid Ontario first. Given your income situation right now, you might qualify. And call the Law Society Referral Service. First half hour is free." I called both numbers from the parking lot. By the time I walked back into the hospital, I had an appointment for the next morning with a family law paralegal aide and a referral for a consultation with a lawyer named Miss Ashworth who specialized in matrimonial property disputes. I did not sleep that night. I lay in our bed in our house and I went through everything I could think of. Our joint accounts, the mortgage, his investment accounts that I only had partial visibility into, the TFSA in his name that he'd opened 3 years ago and that I'd never had login access to. I wrote everything down in a notes app on my phone and then airdropped it to myself 3 times to different backup locations because I didn't fully trust technology that night. The meeting with Miss Ashworth was in a narrow office above a pharmacy on King Street. She was in her late 40s, efficient and unhurried at the same time, the kind of person who has heard everything and judges nothing. I laid it all out for her. The RRSP I'd cashed, the car I'd sold, the caregiving leave that had gutted my income for over a year, the property I'd inherited from my grandmother and contributed to our down payment, and what I'd overheard in the hospital hallway. "The accounts are already sorted," she repeated back to me. Those were his exact words. Yes. She made a note. "Did you have visibility into all your joint financial accounts?" "Most of them. There's a TFSA in his name I've never been able to access, and his real estate commissions, he's self-employed, so those came into a business account I'm not on." She looked up at me. "When did he stop working with the diagnosis?" "About 13 months ago. He took medical leave. The commissions basically stopped." "And in the month or two before his diagnosis, was there anything unusual with the joint accounts? Transfers out, new accounts opened, anything like that?" I thought about it. There was a withdrawal. I remember because it seemed large and he said it was a client retainer he'd had to return. About $18,000. I didn't push on it. She wrote that down too. By the end of that meeting, I understood my situation in a way I hadn't before. Under Ontario's Family Law Act, the matrimonial home has special protections. Neither spouse can sell or mortgage it without the other's consent, regardless of whose name is on the title. The property I'd inherited from my grandmother and used as a down payment could potentially be traced and excluded from equalization, which meant I might be entitled to claim it back as a deduction. The RRSP I'd cashed out was a different matter. Once spent on joint expenses, it was harder to recover, but my contributions as caregiving spouse were not nothing. My year of unpaid work had a legal value. "I want to understand one thing," I said before I left. "He's still in recovery. He could be in hospital for another few weeks. Is there anything I should be doing right now to protect myself?" She handed me a list. It had 6 items on it. I followed every single one. The first thing I did was document everything financial I had access to. I photographed every statement, every account balance, every line of our mortgage. I found his commission records from the past 3 years in a filing folder in his home office, and I photographed those too. I found the withdrawal, the one he called a client retainer return, on a statement from 14 months ago. The date was 11 days before he went to the doctor with the symptoms that led to his diagnosis. I noted that. The second thing I did was tell no one what I was doing. Not his parents, not our mutual friends, not anyone who knew both of us. My cousin was the only exception, and she understood immediately why discretion mattered. The third thing I did was keep showing up at the hospital every day, bringing tea and fruit and the kind of steady, practical love that looks the same on the outside whether or not it still means anything on the inside. I helped him with his medications. I talked to his care team. I smiled at the nurses who had gotten to know my face over the past months. I was the devoted wife, and I played that role without a single missed cue because it bought me time, and time was everything. She kept visiting, sometimes when I was there, sometimes when I wasn't. I could tell by small things. The chair pulled closer to his bed than I'd left it, a takeout container in the recycling that wasn't from anywhere I'd ordered from. I said nothing. I watched everything. One afternoon, I came in to find them looking at something on his phone together, her leaning over his shoulder, his hand resting near hers on the blanket. They separated quickly when I came in. He told me it was a property listing, an old client's, something he'd been tracking. I nodded and went to hang up my coat. Later that week, I came home to find a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. When I called back, a man answered and identified himself as a notary. He said he was calling to confirm a document signing appointment my husband had scheduled. He named a date the following week, the day my husband's care team expected to clear him for discharge. I asked what kind of document. He hesitated. "I'm not able to discuss the details without client authorization. I'm sorry, I must have called the wrong number." He hung up quickly. I called Ms. Ashworth the same evening. A notary appointment on his discharge day, she repeated. That's consistent with what you overheard. Moving quickly while he still has deniability around his mental state due to illness. It's actually a known tactic. She paused. We need to move faster than I originally thought. Within 48 hours, Ms. Ashworth had filed a motion to freeze the disposal of matrimonial assets pending separation proceedings. Under Ontario law, once the motion was filed and served, he legally could not transfer, sell, or encumber any assets we held jointly or that formed part of our net family property without court approval. The freezing order was granted the following day. I was at the hospital when the process server arrived. I had known it was coming, roughly, but not the exact hour. I was in the hallway getting water from the fountain when I saw the server hand the envelope to a nurse and ask to be pointed to room 418. I walked back in the other direction and took the stairs down to the lobby. I sat on a bench outside the main entrance for about 20 minutes. The sky was that particular gray that southern Ontario gets in early spring. Not quite threatening rain, just overcast and still. I watched people come and go through the sliding doors. Visitors, patients being discharged, a teenager walking a very old dog along the path beside the parking lot. My phone rang. It was him. I let it ring. Then I composed myself and went back upstairs. When I walked in, his face was a color I hadn't seen before. Not the pallor of illness, something harder. He was holding the envelope. "What is this?" he said. "You've been served," I said. "Sit down, you're still in recovery and I don't want your blood pressure to spike." "You filed against me." "I protected myself," I said. "There's a difference." "Sarah," he stopped. I don't know why he said that name. It wasn't mine. Maybe he'd had a different conversation planned in his head. A different version of this moment, one where I was someone else. "Megan, listen to me. Whatever you think you heard." "I heard exactly what you said," I told him. "I was in the hallway. You were telling her the accounts were already sorted." His face did something complicated. Then it went very still. "You've been planning this?" he said. "How long have you been planning this?" I didn't answer that. The next few weeks were not easy. Nothing about this process was easy. He was discharged as expected and moved temporarily into a furnished apartment his parents helped him find in Cambridge. His mother called me twice to plead his case. I listened respectfully both times and said very little. I understood she was frightened for her son. I also understood she wasn't in possession of the full picture. My best friend did not call me. I think she understood that anything she said would be heard as evidence. She was right about that. Through Miss Ashworth and her network, a forensic accountant was brought in to trace the financial movements over the previous 14 months, which he found was methodical and, in a terrible way, impressive. The $18,000 I'd noticed, the alleged client retainer, had moved through his business account into a holding account in her name. There was a second transfer, smaller, from a TFSA he'd opened in the months before his diagnosis that I'd never known existed. The property we owned together had not been touched, likely because he knew the matrimonial home protections would complicate any move there. But had he been cleared to see the notary on his discharge day, a co-signatory clause in a related property deal would have quietly redirected a significant portion of our shared equity into a shell arrangement she was connected to through her cousin's numbered company. The forensic accountant presented this in a clear, flat, matter-of-fact way that I found strangely steadying. There's something almost calming about seeing your own betrayal laid out in columns and rows. It makes it legible. It makes it real in a way that feelings can't quite manage. Miss Ashworth submitted the full financial picture as part of our equalization claim. Given the tracing evidence on my grandmother's inheritance, I was credited with a significant deduction on equalization. Given the caregiving contributions, the year of unpaid leave, the RRSP withdrawn, the car sold, the income sacrificed, the court took what Ontario law calls a compensatory approach in assessing the division. It wasn't perfect. Nothing in family law is perfect, but it was fair in the way that fairness actually operates in practice, which is imperfect but honest. He didn't contest much. I think the forensic evidence took the fight out of him, or maybe the illness had, or maybe facing a court where the paper trail was that clear made the math obvious. He kept his car and his personal effects and a portion of the TFSA that was legally determined to be pre-relationship savings. I kept the house. I kept the equity. I kept what could be recovered of my financial future. She was not charged with anything criminal. There wasn't quite enough for that. The transfers were structured carefully enough that the intent was clear to anyone paying attention but not quite provable beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal context. Miss Ashworth explained this to me in the same flat, informative tone she used for everything, and I accepted it. I was disappointed for about 48 hours and then I let it go because carrying it was expensive and I had other things to carry. The hardest part wasn't the legal process. The hardest part was a Tuesday evening in February, about 2 months after everything had concluded, when I was sitting in my kitchen eating leftover soup and my phone buzzed with a message from her. It said, "I'm sorry, I don't expect you to respond. I just needed to say it." I sat there for a long time. I didn't respond, not because I was angry. I was, a little, still, in the dull residual way that takes a long time to fully metabolize, but because I genuinely didn't know what I would have said. Sorry doesn't undo 14 months of watching me sell my grandmother's house and cash in my retirement savings and take the bus in January while you were planning with my husband how to ensure I'd end up with nothing. Sorry doesn't quite reach the shape of that. I don't know what does. Maybe nothing. Maybe that's okay. I went back to work at the clinic in the spring. My manager had kept my hours loosely available and welcomed me back without making a production of it, which I appreciated more than I told her. The regulars who'd been coming in for years asked how I was doing, and I said, fine, and mostly that was true. I was tired in a way that felt structural, like it lived in my bones rather than my schedule, but it was getting better. I made an appointment with a financial planner, someone who specialized in people rebuilding after a major disruption, divorce, illness, job loss. She was younger than I expected and very direct. We looked at the whole picture together, what I had, what I'd recovered, what I'd lost that couldn't be recovered, and what a reasonable path forward looked like. It wasn't the future I'd been building toward before any of this. It was a different one, but it was mine, and it was honest. And that counted for more than I would have expected. There is a moment I keep coming back to, not the hallway outside his hospital room, though that's the moment everything turned. Not the bench outside the hospital, or Ms. Ashworth's office, or the evening I sat at my kitchen table, photographing financial statements with my phone. It's the moment in the elevator going down, when I pressed that button and stood in that small moving box by myself, holding nothing. The coffee I'd left at the nurse's station, my hands empty, and something in my chest that wasn't breaking, it was settling. The way things settle when a truth you've been half-sensing finally lands in full. I think about that woman in the elevator sometimes. How scared she must have been underneath the cold clarity. How much she was carrying that she didn't yet know how to set down. I want to tell her it gets lighter. It does get lighter. I'm still in the house. It's mine now in every way, not just legally. I repainted the front bedroom last month, a soft blue that I picked entirely because I liked it, no consultation, no compromise required. My cousin came over for dinner last week and we sat on the back deck until it got too cold and then moved inside and kept talking. I have a savings account again, small but growing. I put in a contribution to my RRSP last month, the first one since I cashed it out. The receipt sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days because I liked looking at it. I am not who I was before any of this happened. I don't think that's a loss. I think the woman I was before was generous and loving and would have given anything for someone who told her she was worth loving back. And those are not bad qualities. But she was also someone who took a person at his word without asking what his word was actually worth. I've become someone different, more careful. Not harder, I hope, but more honest about the difference between the harbor I thought I'd found and the actual shape of the water. I drove past the hospital a few weeks ago on my way to a dentist's supply pickup. It's on the route if you take the back roads. I glanced up at the building as I passed. 4th floor, the wing he'd been in. I noticed it and then I looked back at the road. The light turned green. I pressed the gas and kept going. I've thought a lot about the moment I set that coffee down at the nurse's station. 2 cups in a cardboard tray, still warm. I just put them there and walked to the elevator, and that small, quiet action turned out to be the first decision I'd made entirely for myself in over a year. I don't think people talk honestly enough about how betrayal actually works. It doesn't usually arrive as one dramatic moment. It arrives as a slow accumulation of small things you explain away, a withdrawal you accept without pushing, a visit you interpret as kindness, a laugh you hear through a door and tell yourself means nothing. My husband and my best friend didn't destroy my life in a single afternoon. They built toward it, carefully and patiently while I was busy keeping him alive. That's what I find hardest to sit with even now. Not the anger, the patience it must have taken them. What I know now is that the choices we make, especially the ones we think no one is watching, have a way of compounding. His choice to move money before his diagnosis, to book a notary for his discharge day, to say the accounts are already sorted in a hospital room with the door not quite closed. Those choices created a paper trail. Her choice to use a cash transaction at a pharmacy, to conduct transfers through her cousin's numbered company, to visit him when she thought I wasn't paying attention. Those choices created a record. They were meticulous, and their meticulousness undid them. The forensic accountant didn't find their plan despite how carefully it was structured. She found it because of how carefully it was structured. I think about what it actually took to get through that period. Not the legal strategy, though, that mattered. The thing underneath the strategy. There was a version of me that could have walked away from that hospital hallway and said nothing, absorbed the loss, told myself it was easier. I understand that version. She wasn't weak, she was just exhausted, and exhaustion makes smallness feel like peace. What pulled me forward was something I can only describe as a refusal to be dishonest with myself. I had heard what I heard. I knew what I knew. Pretending otherwise would have required me to become someone I didn't want to be, someone who traded her own clarity for a quiet life built on a lie. That felt like a worse kind of loss than anything the courts could have handed me. Miss Ashworth told me once, in her particular straightforward way, that the clients who do best in these proceedings are the ones who come in clear-eyed, not angry, not vengeful, clear. They know what happened, they know what they need, and they're willing to do the steady, unglamorous work of documentation and patience. I think that's true of most hard things. The feelings are real and they matter, but feelings alone don't build the case. You have to be willing to sit across from someone who betrayed you and present facts. You have to be able to hold both the grief and the strategy at the same time without letting either collapse the other. My cousin used to say that integrity isn't about being good when it's easy, it's about being honest when dishonesty would cost you less. I held on to that a lot during those months. Every time I reminded him to take his medication, every time I smiled at her in the hospital corridor, I was also choosing not to become someone who manipulates or retaliates carelessly. I wanted to win, but I wanted to win clean. And I did. The house is mine. My savings are growing again. I repainted a room in a color I chose alone, and no one asked me to justify it. That's what the other side of all this looks like. Not triumph, just the ordinary freedom of a life that belongs entirely to you.